So today we'll be talking about chapter 4, section 3, and it's titled The Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire in the ancient world was famous for governing through tolerance and wisdom. And this empire lasted more than 200 years. Where are we talking about? This is the land of Iran today. It's a land that was fertile, meaning crops would grow well there. They had enough rainfall to support a large population. It also was rich in minerals, meaning that when it came to mining for iron and copper and quarrying for stone, for building materials, and cutting trees, just it was a wealthy land in regards to resources. Now, the folks who rose to power there were two groups called the Medes and the Persians. And so if you're familiar with the story of the Persian invasions, maybe you've watched the movie 300 and learned about Xerxes and his famous invasion of the Greeks and the 300 Spartans who stood against them. These are those same folks. In fact, they had conquered the Greeks, and the Greeks were rebelling against them. And Xerxes, a successor to King Cyrus, was dealing with that rebellion. We'll talk about that more in a little while. Well, the empire dates back to 550 BCE. And this famous King Cyrus began this empire by conquering neighboring lands. The Persian Empire, and we'll see it on a map in a moment, was far larger than the Assyrian Empire. The problem with the Assyrians was they were so feared and cruel that they had to stay feared and cruel to maintain their empire. And so they were limited in how far they could spread, because unless they had lots of angry Assyrians who would cut everybody's heads off, they couldn't go any further. And so with the Persians, since they had effective administrators and a policy of tolerance and wisdom, they were able to maintain a larger empire. For example, they would honor local customs. So when the Persians conquered Judea, which is where Jerusalem is, which is where the Hebrews lived, they said, if you want to worship Yahweh, worship Yahweh. That's not our thing, but we're cool with that. You do what you want to do. Here's what we need from you guys. We need you to pay your taxes. Every now and then we might need some soldiers. Pay your taxes, and then if we have to call you for an emergency, we'll reserve the right to do so. Otherwise, build your temple, worship your gods, marry who you want to, be free, live your life. And utilizing that policy of tolerance, Cyrus was able to build a fairly large empire, because he was also able to offer in return, hey, guess what? If somebody messes with you, we've got your back. We're going to look after you. We're going to help you. And so, here's an ancient drawing of the Persians conquering the Jews. But what I want to really draw attention to is the next drawing. This is the Persians after they've conquered, ruling peacefully and wisely with tolerance. Of course, where am I talking about? I just wanted to show you here. The former Assyrian Empire ranged from Syria to the Zagros Mountains. And, it did encompass what is today the nation-state of Israel. It did encompass Babylonia, and, of course, their capital at the ancient city of Nineveh. But then when you get into the Persian Empire extended all the way to the Hindu Kush Mountains there, if you see those. That's getting into the Himalayas near where India is today. And it extended to the west all the way to where the ancient city of Troy is. So if you can see over to the left, Lydia next to Greece. Now, by the time of the reign of Darius, much of Greece had been conquered. And Egypt had been conquered. Again, this empire we're talking is huge. Now, a couple of the really important developments of this. I know it doesn't show it on here, but you see the royal road The Royal Road was the first interstate highway system. It extended all the way from the city-state of Sardis all the way down to near the Zagros Mountains in Susa, near the former Babylonian Empire. And so the Persians developed an effective system of transportation and communication through the empire, had an effective system of ruling through local governors called satraps, also an effective system of tax collection, meaning they were able to gather revenue from all the provinces that they had conquered. And so in general, they were just good at this government stuff. Okay, so this is a drawing of the reconstruction of the temple of the Jews under the reign of Solomon. And the reason I showed you this is because the Jews were allowed to rebuild their temple under the Persians, who didn't care who they worshipped or what they did as long as they paid their taxes. Now, Cambyses was the son of Cyrus. He was famous for extending the empire. Conquered Egypt, extended the empire a little further near what was once Macedonia, around the archipelago of Greece. However, he was not quite the leader that Cyrus was. He was constantly dealing with rebellions during his lifetime. He had this reputation from his people of being a less effective version of Cyrus. So he was always living in Cyrus's shadow. In fact, by the end of his rule, Darius seized control. Managed to put down all the different rebellions. And to be honest, all of these ancient empires are commonly dealing with rebellions. And so it's often the task of these leaders to put down rebellions, especially during a transition of power. And so when Darius seized control, that was the first thing he had to do, was to put down other rebellions. And then once he solidified his position, then he was free to expand the empire. And he was the one who took the Persian Empire all the way into the Hindu Kush Mountains near what is today India. So kind of the question, the theory that we're working off of here is, how do you govern a large empire? How do you manage a large group of people? It's tough enough to manage a small group when you can see them and talk to them and learn their names and work with them every day. But then imagine trying to run a large group of people, where there's too many to learn their names and talk to them and work with them every day. You're going to have to delegate power. When you're dealing with a large country, there's no way one person can do it by themselves. And so, some of the techniques that the Persians developed. Number one, they had a large military. If you're going to have a large empire, you've got to have a large military. For example, the United States is a large country, and we spend more on our military than any other country does. Number two, you got to divide the territories into provinces. And guys, guess what? When we came up with our country, we basically copied off this list. Okay, so number two, you got to divide your place into provinces. The state of North Carolina, the state of South Carolina, the county of Henderson County, the principality, the municipality of Hendersonville. Then finally, local self-government. We have a degree of local self-government here in the United States. If Henderson County schools decide to go on a 2-hour delay tomorrow because of snow, that's their business. They have to follow certain state guidelines, and the state has to follow certain federal guidelines, but we do have a degree of local self-government. And then finally, we are encouraged in this country to speak a common language. It's not a requirement, but we are encouraged. There's not a common religion, but some countries do have that. In the Persian Empire, they have a common religion and a common culture, but it was not required. And then finally, of course, the Royal Road was a big deal.
Timber for siege engines. To acquire these tools of war, the Assyrians campaigned farther and farther afield and brought back the spoils of victory.
Gold, silver, tin, copper, linen garments with many splendid trimmings, large and small monkeys, ivory, ebony. This their tribute I received, and they embraced my feet.
From his throne in Nineveh, the king knew where the peace was kept and where it was broken. Messengers relayed signals from fire towers or wrote dispatches on clay tablets. In 701 BC, the Assyrian king Sennacherib received troubling word from the province of Judah. Its king refused to pay tribute. Sennacherib was furious. He mobilized his army, tens of thousands strong, then swelled its ranks from states who owed him allegiance.
Get together your prefects and the horses of your cavalry immediately. Whoever is late will be impaled in the middle of his house.
Before the Assyrians set off, priests sacrificed bulls and goats, and the troops prayed to Ishtar, goddess of war.
O thou, heroine among the gods, like a bundle rip him open in the midst of battle. Raise up against him a tempest, an evil wind.
At the outset, the Assyrians enjoyed an advantage possessed by few enemies: mobility. They would travel along good roads, maintained by the shovels of prisoners of war. On flat land, they could advance 20 miles a day. The king rode at the front among his cavalry and chariots, followed by his infantry. Behind them all snaked a long supply train, where craftsmen made weapons as they rode. In surmounting natural obstacles, especially rivers, the Assyrians reached new heights of ingenuity. Vehicles were carried in large boats, horses swimming behind, troops crossing on inflated animal skins, shields and weapons strapped to their backs. Living off the land, such a host would not have gone far. Because the king had set up huge granaries throughout the empire, his troops could campaign up to 300 miles from a base of supply. Truly could the king of Assyria make his power felt far and wide. Without such supplies, they could not feed the herds of horses so vital to the Assyrian army, whose most feared weapon was the chariot. Like the Egyptians, the Assyrians had improved on the clumsy four-wheeled carts of Babylonia. Massing their two-wheeled chariots like shock troops, they broke an enemy's line and showered it with arrows and spears. Into this chaos, the cavalry, waiting on the flanks, charged. Whoever fled was run down. Whoever remained was picked off by archers and spearmen. But the Assyrians avoided shooting horses. So important were they that the king appointed officials to oversee their capture, mostly taken from northern Iran. As the supply of horses increased, the Assyrians developed a new weapon, as valuable as the chariot: the horseman. At first, he was merely a cheaper version of the charioteer, two men manning two horses. One steered and held a shield, while the other used his bow. Soon the mounted warrior came into his own. Mobility matched with speed, matched with firepower. Against such a foe, the Judean king Hezekiah dared not risk battle. He retreated within his capital, Jerusalem. All over Judah, his subjects fled to their own towns. Their narrow streets overshadowed by high walls up to 20 feet thick. To withstand the siege that would surely come, Hezekiah dug an underground channel to bring water into Jerusalem. Where the Assyrians could not send their army, they dispatched terror. At Jerusalem, a high Assyrian official strode up to the walls. He spoke not to the king and his Jewish commanders in the language of diplomacy, but to the defenders on the battlements in their native Hebrew.
I am talking to the people on the wall, who will have to eat their excrement and drink their urine. Hezekiah cannot save you. And do not let him persuade you to rely on the Lord. The Emperor of Assyria commands you to surrender.
While he delivered this threat, the promise of doom was being fulfilled 30 miles to the south, at the town of Lachish. Built astride the trade route to Egypt, Lachish was as strong as it was rich. Behind its steep slopes and high walls, its defenders were confident of holding out. Just as confident, the Assyrians set up their camp behind an oval wall with defensive towers and set about building siege engines. The wooden walls would protect the soldiers inside as they manned an iron battering ram. With it, they would pound the weakest point in the city's walls.
Fear. The city is rank with it. Let us ease their pain. Release the prisoners. Catapult!
The alternative to tolerance and compassion and wisdom, of course, is the Assyrians. And when you're dealing with an ancient people that are used to any type of disloyalty, any type of lack of going along with it, of submission, any lack of submission met with such cruelty as we just witnessed, then yeah, I mean, when you have a leader that shows compassion and administers effectively, that's a milestone. So Darius divided the empire into 20 different areas of local administration, basically states. Each state had a governor called a satrap, and then there was a royal road that connected all of these different states, and so that soldiers could easily be sent to fix problems. Aid could be brought if a disaster were to hit. And Darius even set up a common currency that can be used throughout the empire. So some of the oldest currency known to man is the Persian currency. And these are gold coins, and they have King Darius's image on them. Another thing you got to do, or you need to do if you're going to rule an empire effectively, is you need to be seen. You know, everybody could describe the president in a nutshell. You know, down to the hair, to the suit, to the face. You could give a basic description of your president. Why? Because that person is seen on television, on media, all over the place. Well, for better or worse, you could describe that person. Now, what are you going to do if you don't have television? If you don't have social media to put your image on every day so that everybody knows who that person looks like and you could just recognize that person, again, for better or worse. Well, you got to have lots of statues, lots of drawings, lots of images of you. So, the next map here, I just wanted to zoom into part of the Persian Empire. Again, there's the land of Canaan, the region of Judea, the former Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire after that. And I just want you to realize that all of this land, along with the regions of Asia all the way into India, were conquered and maintained and ruled by the Persian Empire. So one of the ways to unite a group of people is to develop a common currency. In fact, this was one of the early challenges of the early United States, was we need a central bank, we need a common currency. And it was often a matter of heavy debate, but Darius already proved that is an important way to run an empire. In fact, here's one of the oldest coins in the known world. Okay, so what types of cultural achievements were the Persians known for? Well, one is called Zoroastrianism. A lot of Christianity was based on Zoroastrianism. A lot of modern movies, even Star Wars, borrowed from a lot of these philosophical concepts. And so here's the idea. Life is a battleground between good and evil. The two are seen as polar opposites, one defined by the other. Zoroaster taught that there was one God and that he would judge us by the deeds in life. How well did we stand for the good? And Zoroastrianism had a heavy influence on Judaism, on Christianity, and on Islam. So here's a drawing of Zoroaster. He lived from about 628 BCE to about 551 BCE. Just for reference, the first 5 books of the Old Testament were written down in about 350 BCE. These teachings were well established by the time of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Another important aspect of the Persian of the Persian legacy is political order. That is, through tolerance and good government, the Persians brought political order to the ancient world. If the Judeans had a problem with the Syrians, they could go to King Cyrus and talk to him and say, the Syrians are being mean to us. And King Cyrus could say, stop. And they would have to stop. That's a version of order that did not exist prior to the Persian Empire. But also they preserved earlier cultures. Again, the fact that these people could live and believe how they want to, but yet still be part of a powerful and unified empire, it's significant. It makes for peace and prosperity.
Lachish's weak point was its gates. To approach them, the Assyrians first had to erect earthen ramparts covered with timber. Over these, the siege engines were slowly wheeled. The king marshaled his forces. Stone slingers at the rear, then the archers protected by their tall shields. At the very front, the spear carriers who would storm the walls. Together, they advanced, safe behind their huge siege engines. The engines themselves, vulnerable to burning arrows, were protected by leather sheaths. A soldier holding a huge ladle would douse any fire that broke out. Below, sappers using iron and bronze tools began to undermine the walls. Above, other soldiers mounted ladders to scale them. No army had so perfected the art of siege. Such an onslaught could not be withstood. When finally the walls were breached, the Assyrians rushed in, shielded by Ishtar, goddess of war.
Thy face shall not turn green, thy feet shall not tire, thy strength shall not fail thee in the heat of battle.
Ishtar spoke the truth, but the carnage was unspeakable. The ringleaders of the rebellion were impaled on stakes outside the city, their limp bodies a warning to other Judeans still holding out. King Sennacherib rewarded his soldiers with their share of quivers, daggers, bows, furniture, and goblets. Not all tasted the fruits of victory. At Lachish, 1,500 Assyrians, overlooked by Ishtar, would lie together in a mass grave. Meanwhile, King Sennacherib made good his losses and counted his spoils.
200,000 people, great and small, male and female. Horses, mules, camels, asses, cattle and sheep, without number.
In Judah, as elsewhere, the Assyrians made sure the spirit of the conquered was indeed broken. They uprooted their subjects by the hundreds of thousands and carried them off into bondage in Assyria. The Bible records that in 721 BC, 30,000 inhabitants of Samaria were thus deported. The lost tribes of Israel.
As for Hezekiah, the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by leveling with battering rams and by bringing up siege engines, I did take.
In the 50 years after the subjugation of Judah, Assyria pushed its borders to their farthest. In 675 BC, its warriors marched more than 1,000 miles and conquered Egypt. Assyria had reached its most glorious height. In its cities, peopled by merchants, craftsmen, artists, and scholars, civilization flourished as it never had. But the Assyrians had overreached. The empire now spanned the whole of the Middle East. Instead of governing its subjects, Assyria terrorized them. The conquered nursed their grudges and bided their time. In 612 BC, Assyria's greatest enemies united and marched on Nineveh. The great city was sacked. A society 1,000 years old collapsed, and its empire vanished. Fittingly, Assyria would suffer yet one more outrage. its epitaph would be written by one of its own victims, the prophet Nahum.
All who hear the news of your destruction clap their hands for joy. Did no one escape your endless cruelty?